The tablet is small, just 14 centimeters across, not much more than the width of a hand. And yet it doesn't sit in anyone's hand now. It rests in a climate-controlled vault at Columbia University under soft archival lighting, sealed in a protective case, tagged with a name that sounds more like a catalog number than a presence Plimpton 322. The clay is the color of dried desert sand. Its surface holds wedge-shaped indentations pressed into it 4,000 years ago. Quiet marks, patient marks, the kind that don't demand attention from a passing glance. To an untrained eye, it can look like any other fragment from ancient Mesopotamia. Another broken voice from a city whose streets no longer exist. Another record among thousands, grain counts, temple offerings, administrative routines. But this one isn't that, and that's where the discomfort begins. Because what's inscribed here isn't commerce. It isn't rations. It isn't a list of names. It's mathematics, pure mathematics, 15 rows of numbers arranged in columns with a kind of calm procedural confidence. And when mathematicians in the 1940s translated it and realized what they were looking at, it didn't feel like a simple discovery. It felt like a quiet reversal. The table presents relationships we call Pythagorean triples number sets tied to right triangles, relationships often associated in the modern story we tell ourselves with Greek mathematics much later. Not just the fact that these relationships appear here, but how they appear. Because this isn't a student's scratch work. It doesn't show messy correction. It doesn't show the stutter step of a mind inventing something in real time. It reads like a finished reference, like a tool meant to be used, like something compiled after the hard work was already done, after someone already knew. And that detail matters, not because it forces a conclusion, but because it changes the feeling of the question. If this is a reference table, what does that imply about the world that produced it, about the education that supported it, about the methods that generated it? Methods we don't see written down here because the tablet doesn't bother to explain itself. It simply presents results, cleanly, precisely, as if precision were normal. And that is a theme that keeps appearing in certain Sumerian and Mesopotamian inscriptions, not the fantasy of a lost world, not the sensational claim that everything we know is wrong, but a more restrained, more unsettling impression. The impression that some of these texts don't read like early experiments. They read like documentation, like manuals, like the careful preservation of understanding that already existed before the clay was pressed. The cuneiform script was deciphered over a century ago. The problem isn't that we can't read it. The discomfort the thing rarely said out loud in published papers, but acknowledged in private exchanges and conference corners, is what the earliest texts sound like once you can read them. They don't sound like the first steps. They sound like the continuation of something, and before we go any further, notice the shape of that claim. It doesn't insist on anything supernatural. It doesn't demand a missing civilization. It simply pauses over the tone of the record itself. The feeling of a table that doesn't introduce itself. The feeling of a writing system that arrives already structured. The feeling of a culture that at the moment it becomes visible in writing already seems to be speaking in full sentences. So we circle back to the same question again and again, because it refuses to stay answered. Were the Sumerians inventing knowledge, or were they in some sense remembering it, preserving it, copying it forward? You can feel how quickly that question becomes slippery. And that's why we move slowly. Before the wedge, there were tokens, small clay objects shaped like cones, spheres, discs. A cone might represent a small measure of grain. a sphere might represent more, simple, tactile, limited. This system persisted for thousands of years across the ancient Near East, adequate for early agricultural communities tracking harvests, debts, trade. And then in archaeological terms, something happens fast. Around 3200 BCE, in the Sumerian city of Uruk, the token system expands into full writing. Not over centuries, not through a long visible chain of incremental steps. Within what may have been 2 or 3 generations, marks on clay become a system capable of recording complex grammar, abstract concepts, layered meanings. The wedge-shaped impressions we call cuneiform appear already systematic, already standardized, already functioning at a level that suggests conventions were already in place. The earliest tablets from Uruk don't look like hesitant experimentation. They look like organized information architecture, administrative records structured with consistency lists categorized by type numerical notation, switching between decimal and sexagesimal systems with a kind of practiced ease. And this is where developmental linguists begin to shift in their seats. Because in every well-documented case, writing systems emerge gradually. Egyptian hieroglyphs show developmental stages. Chinese characters evolve over centuries. Even the alphabet Phoenician traders and the chain of antecedents has a comprehensible progression, step by step, generation by generation. Each stage builds on the last. Cuneiform in its early appearance seems to skip steps. And then there are the tablets from Abu Salabik, excavated in the 1960s and 1970s, dated to around 2600 BCE. These texts include not only administrative records, but literary compositions, works like the Instructions of Shuruppak, wisdom literature presented as a father advising his son. It isn't the age that shocks scholars, it's the completeness. The language flows with rhetorical control, parallelism, careful repetition, metaphoric complexity. The text uses deliberate patterns that create rhythm and cadence. It doesn't sound like a culture discovering how to write literature for the first time. It sounds like a culture doing something it already knows how to do. The archaeologist Thorkild Jacobsen noted this anomaly. The literature doesn't show the experimental quality expected from a new medium. The scribes aren't figuring out how to make a tablet carry story and instruction. They're executing a craft. And that execution appears consistently across different cities, Uruk, Abu Salabik, Shuruppak, as if what we're seeing is not isolated invention, but shared knowledge, a common source. Then there's the Kesh Temple Hymn, another text from the Abu Salabik corpus, dedicated to the goddess Ninhursag and her temple. Its structure is carefully organized section by section, with architectural precision in its composition. It assumes familiarity with divine genealogies, mythic frameworks, ritual terminology. It doesn't pause to explain basic concepts. It speaks as if its audience already knows. And modern archaeologists often respond with a reasonable explanation, oral tradition. A rich verbal heritage may have existed long before writing. The sudden sophistication of early texts might reflect the transcription of already mature oral compositions. And yes, oral cultures can preserve astonishing complexity. The Vedic hymns, Greek epic tradition, Polynesian genealogies. Human memory can do more than modern assumptions sometimes allow, but the oral explanation introduces its own tension. Because oral and written cultures process information differently, Transcribing oral tradition usually leaves traces, formulaic phrases, repetitive epithets, episodic structures designed for flexible recitation. Homeric epics are filled with repeated descriptions because those repetitions help memory. Early Sumerian texts show some repetition, yes, but they also show literary techniques that serve no mnemonic function. They play with word order for emphasis. They deploy rare vocabulary for precise shading. They use grammatical constructions that are difficult to preserve through purely oral transmission. They read like compositions made for the tablet. And the language itself, in its earliest preserved form, displays features associated with maturity, elaborate verb systems, case markings enabling flexible word order, abstract vocabulary for justice, destiny, cosmic order, terms that typically stabilize later after long development. So the question returns and returns and returns. If writing emerged to meet practical administrative needs, why do some of the earliest tablets show such literary refinement? If cuneiform evolved naturally from pictographic tokens, why does it appear so suddenly standardized across multiple cities? Maybe there is a missing developmental phase. Maybe earlier tablets haven't been found. Excavations continue. The record changes. That possibility remains open. But another possibility also remains quietly, persistently, because the texts themselves keep hinting at it. What if the earliest scribes weren't inventing a medium of expression? What if they were trying to preserve something that already existed? And if that's even partly true, then the clay in those vaults isn't just recording the start of literacy. It's recording an act of preservation. And once you allow that thought to sit for a moment, the atmosphere changes. Because now the question isn't simply, how did they figure this out? It becomes, what did they feel they were about to lose? Lose clay, unlike papyrus or parchment, does not forget easily. Fired properly, a tablet can survive almost indefinitely. It becomes less like paper and more like pottery, resistant to decay, indifferent to time. That durability changes the meaning of writing itself. If you live in a world where flood fire and war can erase generations, then permanence becomes a kind of strategy. A clay tablet is not only a message, it is a shelter for information. And when we remember that when we hold that fact beside the early sophistication of Sumerian texts, the same question returns again, not as an argument, but as a slow pressure. Were these tablets records of invention, or were they records of preservation? Because the tablets we possess today represent only a fraction of what once existed. Entire libraries vanished. War, flood, neglect, heat. Even the famous library of Ashurbanipal survives mostly as fragments pulled from ruins. And if that's true of later periods, what about earlier ones? What archives disappeared before they were ever copied forward? What sources did scribes consult that we no longer have? If the earliest writing looks mature, one way to read that maturity is simple. Perhaps the sources were older than the tablets themselves. Perhaps scribes copied. Perhaps they compiled. Perhaps they recorded what they believed must not be lost. The clay does not answer this, but it keeps insisting we ask. And then we come to another object in another vault, the Weld-Blundell prism housed in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, catalogue number 1923.444. A clay prism about 20 centimeters tall, 4 sides, inscribed in neat columns of cuneiform. When scholars translated it, they found something historians longed for: the most complete version of the Sumerian king list ever recovered. A chronological record, city by city, reign by reign, tracing sovereignty from the moment kingship descended from heaven down to dynasties that exist within the range of archaeology and cross-referenced inscription. On the surface, it looks like a political document, a way of establishing legitimacy, continuity, the order of rule. It is in form a bureaucratic artifact. It reads like administration, and then it begins. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Eridu, the first city, the origin point in Sumerian imagination. And the king list names rulers. It assigns reign lengths. It moves forward with calm, methodical confidence. The first king, Alulim, ruled for 28,800 years. His successor reigned for 36,000. The list continues like this: 8 kings collectively governing 241,200 years before a great flood swept over the land. Modern scholarship almost reflexively labels these numbers mythological. No human being lives tens of thousands of years. Therefore, the numbers must be symbolic cosmic ages, divine epics, time measured by a different standard than ordinary years. Then after the flood, the text shifts. Reign lengths shorten. They descend gradually toward plausibility. By the time we reach dynasties confirmed by other sources, the list becomes reliable. And that is the standard reading: legendary early section, historical later section. But notice what this explanation does not address. It does not address the precision. These are not vague mythic spans like an age or 1,000 generations. These are exact values, structured values, numbers with regularities. And scholars have noticed that the pre-flood reign lengths are divisible by 3,600, a significant unit in Sumerian sexagesimal mathematics, 1 shar, a complete numerical unit. So the question shifts slightly, but it does not go away. If the early section is purely symbolic, why is it so mathematically organized? If it's merely myth, why does it resemble accounting myths often operate through resonance, not calculation? Divine beings don't need their reigns enumerated down to a structured unit. Timeless figures do not require bureaucratic totals, and yet the king list treats its pre-flood rulers with the same clerical seriousness it applies to later kings, names, numbers, succession. It does not mark a boundary between legend and history. It speaks as if it is simply recording. Then it says, after the flood had swept over and kingship had descended from heaven, kingship was in Kish. Kish is a real place, archaeologically attested. The early Kish kings still reign for absurd lengths, 1 for 1,200 years, but the numbers continue their descent. The list moves step by step toward the familiar scale of decades. And in that later section appears a name that once seemed purely mythic: Gilgamesh. For much of the 20th century, Gilgamesh was treated as legend, an epic hero, a literary invention. And then, administrative tablets and economic documents from the early dynastic period began to mention him in contexts that suggested he was a historical ruler, building projects, temple renovations, campaigns. The mythic figure showed up in paperwork. The legendary king turned out to have a historical shadow. And once that happens, once a myth acquires a documented anchor, the question spreads backward. If Gilgamesh had a historical basis, what about the kings listed before him? What about the names recorded with the same documentary tone? What about the pre-flood rulers treated with equal seriousness? The text makes no distinction. The distinction is ours. So scholars propose alternatives. Perhaps the huge numbers refer to dynastic periods, not individual lifespans. Perhaps the years represent months or seasons. Perhaps the calendar system differed. These attempts share a common impulse to preserve the king list as a document that intends to record political succession, even if parts of its content require reinterpretation. Because the genre matters. This isn't a hymn, it isn't an epic, it's a king list. And king lists across cultures serve a practical purpose: legitimacy, succession, continuity. So, if the compilers intended administrative continuity, where did they get their information? The Weld-Blundell prism dates to around 1800 BCE, the Old Babylonian period. Yet it reaches back into time through the flood into an epic no historian can confirm directly. The composition implies sources, records, preserved archives, maintained information, carried forward through disruption. And that is where the flood narrative, ironically, becomes more than mythic scenery. Because the king list itself treats the flood as a break, a discontinuity that swept away the world that was. Yet the list bridges that gap. How another Sumerian text offers a clue: the Eridu Genesis preserved on tablet CBS 1673 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. Fragmentary, damaged, but readable enough to reveal its central motion: the gods decide to destroy humanity. Enki, the deity of wisdom and freshwater, warns a man named Ziusudra, speaking through a reed wall, avoiding direct violation of divine prohibition. Build a boat. And what survives of the instructions carries a striking tone, not vague mythic suggestion, but procedural guidance. Technical specification. Parameters meant to be followed. And again, the same theme rises: before catastrophe knowledge exists. Before collapse, someone tries to preserve it. Not only life knowledge, and as we move into the flood tablet itself, as we watch the narrative become technical, almost instructional, the same question will return in another form, quietly, insistently. Were these texts inventing explanations, or were they preserving procedures? Tablet CB S 10,000, 673 lies in the University of Pennsylvania Museum's Babylonian collection. Its brownish-orange clay, worn down by millennia, broken where fractures took pieces away. What remains is partial, yes, but not unclear in its direction. It preserves one of humanity's oldest coherent flood narratives, the Sumerian account scholars call the Eridu Genesis. And the first thing to notice is how the tablet behaves. It begins like so many ancient stories begin, with order. The world is established, cities are founded, civilization is organized, there is structure before the break. Then damage interrupts the text lines, lost motives missing, until the story resumes with a decision that feels absolute. The gods have chosen to destroy humanity. A flood will sweep over the land, eliminating life. The tablet doesn't fully explain why. Those lines are missing, and that absence matters because it creates a strange contrast with what follows. The decision is irreversible. But Enki objects. Enki, later called Ea in Akkadian, appears again in Mesopotamian literature as the god who bends around harsh decrees, who finds loopholes in cosmic rules, who protects humans in ways that are almost technical in their cleverness. In this version, Enki warns a man named Ziusudra speaking through a reed wall, a detail that can sound like poetry until you realize what it accomplishes. Enki can claim he never directly warned the man he spoke to the wall, The wall heard, the man listened, the loophole holds. And then comes the instruction, build a boat. That phrase is simple, almost too simple. But what survives of the flood tradition is not simple in its tone. It becomes specific, procedural, practical. Even in CBS 10,673 fragmentary as it is, you can feel the direction instructions meant to be followed. Parameters, not metaphors. And when we move outward from this tablet to other Mesopotamian flood narratives clearly derived from the same tradition, the Atrahasis epic, the flood account embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the technical precision becomes impossible to ignore. The boat is not described as a vague ark drifting on divine mercy. It is described as an engineered object. Dimensions specified in cubits, length, width, height, recorded as exact measurements. Internal structure, described multiple decks, compartmentalization partitions. Waterproofing instructions, bitumen pitch, sealing procedures. In the version told to Gilgamesh Tablet 11, in the later tradition, the specification becomes almost obsessive. The vessel is to be constructed as a perfect cube, each side measuring 120 cubits, about 60 meters. Inside, 7 decks divide the space vertically. 9 sections partition it horizontally. Layers of waterproofing seal the hull. The construction process unfolds step by step, from laying the keel to sealing the roof. Quantities are specified, worker crews enumerated, a timeline implied, as if this is not only story, but record. And scholars have done something with these details that ancient scribes could not have anticipated. Modern analysts, naval architects among them, have tested the design's plausibility. And the unsettling thing is that the design works. A cube-shaped vessel looks strange to modern intuition. We want bows and sterns. We want direction. We want sleekness. But stability in violent water does not require elegance. A cube has no directional bias, no preferred orientation. It resists capsizing because it has no right side in the way a long ship does. The multiple decks distribute weight. The compartments add integrity. The size allows it to survive conditions that would swallow smaller craft. So we return to the question, but we return slowly and more than once because the question changes tone depending on how you phrase it. If the flood narrative is myth, why does it contain so much engineering? If it is theology, why does it read like a manual? If it is symbolic, why do the details function? You could say details increase realism. Details make a story persuasive. And yes, literature does that. But notice what kind of details these are. Not poetic embellishments, not decorative descriptions, but technical parameters. The exact quantity of pitch required for waterproofing. The number of decks. The partitioning scheme. And the question returns again, phrased differently. Why did the tradition preserve the logistics of survival rather than only the moral meaning? Because flood myths exist worldwide, but most do not behave like this. The biblical account of Noah gives basic dimensions, but it does not deliver a step-by-step engineering plan. Greek stories mention survival containers, but not construction specifications. Many flood narratives emphasize judgment rebirth, divine anger, human guilt. The Mesopotamian accounts do something else. They embed instructions. And then inside the flood narrative, another strange inversion appears, quiet, almost easy to miss if you read quickly. After the flood subsides and Ziusudra emerges, he offers sacrifices. The gods who decided to destroy humanity are overcome by the scent of the offering. The text uses a visceral metaphor. They gather like flies over the sacrifice. It is an image that feels almost unbecoming for divine beings. But that is precisely why it matters. It exposes something like dependency. The gods realize they need humans. Without humans to maintain temples, perform rituals, provide offerings, the divine order itself faces diminishment. The relationship is not one-directional. It's symbiotic. Humans depend on gods, yes, but the gods also depend on humans. And that leads into a broader theological framework present in Mesopotamian texts. Humans were created to relieve divine labor. Junior deities, exhausted by the work of maintaining creation, rebel. Humans are formed as replacement workers, not as ornaments, not as beloved children. As labor canals dug fields, cultivated cities, built temples, maintained. Practical theology, not metaphor, or at least metaphor expressed as machinery. So the flood becomes more than punishment. It becomes a threat to cosmic function. If humans vanish, who maintains the system? Who does the work? And in that light, the technical precision of the survival instructions takes on a different meaning. If humans have a functional role in maintaining reality, then preserving human knowledge becomes not optional, but essential. Engineering principles, agricultural methods, mathematical practice, administrative technique, medical treatments. These are not luxuries, they are operational. A catastrophe that kills humans also kills the accumulated expertise required to rebuild civilization. And so the boat must work. The specifications must be sound. The details must be preserved. And we return again because repetition here is not redundancy. It's a way of feeling the shape of the possibility. If the details mattered, maybe they were remembered because they worked. If the details are precise, maybe precision is itself the sign of preservation. And we know from archaeology that devastating floods did occur in Mesopotamia. The Tigris and Euphrates overflowed regularly. Some floods would have been catastrophic. Excavations at Sumerian cities reveal flood layers, thick deposits of clean clay between occupation levels, indicating inundation and abandonment. Leonard Woolley's excavations at found a sterile clay deposit more than 2 meters thick beneath the royal cemetery. Woolley initially believed he had found evidence of a universal flood, an idea that later scrutiny rejected. The layer was local, not global, and dated to around 4000 BCE, too early for the literary flood, as described. But the discovery established something more restrained, and perhaps more important: severe floods happened. Severe enough to bury cities, severe enough to break continuity. So the question becomes more careful, more precise, less dramatic. How much of the flood story is memory? How much is elaboration? How much of the technical detail is documentation? And how much is literary invention? And we don't have an answer. The clay will endorse. But we do see the pattern. Technical precision appears inside mythological frame, not as ornament, but as procedure. And when we set that next to Plimpton, 3, 2, 2 numbers without derivation, and next to early cuneiform writing without visible development, and next to literary texts that arrive already mature, we begin to feel the same interpretive gravity pulling again. These documents keep acting like repositories, not like experiments, repositories. And that brings us to a text that wears the theme almost openly, a wisdom text that presents itself as counsel from a king to his son, located in the world before catastrophe in the world that will be swept away. The Instructions of Shuruppak. wisdom before the wise, Maz. And in the next part, we move into that text language, its technical vocabulary, its assumed frameworks, and we ask the same question yet again from another angle. Are we watching a civilization invent wisdom or preserve it? The instructions of Shuruppak exist in multiple copies spread across centuries and collections. The earliest versions come from Abu Salabik, dating to around 2600 BC. Later copies appear across Mesopotamia, suggesting the text mattered enough to be recopied again and again, surviving not because clay is durable, but because someone kept choosing to preserve it. And the text frames itself with an almost deliberate insistence. This is inherited wisdom. Shuruppak, a king, speaks to his son Ziusudra, the same Ziusudra who will later survive the flood. Whether that framing is historical memory or literary device, it establishes the atmosphere. This is not new insight. This is counsel carried forward. Wisdom from before the break. And much of the content is on the surface familiar, practical. Do not commit theft. Do not break into a house. Do not act as a guarantor for loans. Do not open accounts at court. Advice about reputation. Advice about authority. Advice that sounds like the kind of counsel any parent might give in any culture, trying to preserve stability. But the deeper discomfort, again, the quiet academic discomfort, doesn't come from what is advised. It comes from what the text assumes without explaining. Because the language is not only moral, it is technical. Take the line, "Do not pass judgment when you drink beer." A modern listener hears this as common sense. Don't make important decisions while intoxicated. But the Sumerian phrasing, according to specialists, employs legal terminology used elsewhere in cuneiform legal texts as a specialized term for formal judicial decisions reached through established procedure. The advice is not merely "don't be sloppy." It is closer to "do not exercise judicial authority while impaired." And that matters because it implies something about the society behind the sentence. It implies recognized judicial roles, formal legal procedure, a system stable enough that judgment is not an informal act, but an institutional function. And the text does not explain this. It does not pause to teach what courts or what judges do, how authority operates. It assumes the reader knows. This pattern repeats. Advice about proper relations with nobles presumes complex social hierarchy. Guidance about maintaining one's house uses architectural terms that assume standardized construction practice. Instructions about field management reference administrative structures for agriculture. The text references systems without explaining them. It deploys technical vocabulary without definitions. It behaves like a document written inside a mature world addressed to an audience already trained to understand that world. And this is where the paradox returns, not as a shout, but as a persistent, quiet echo. These tablets are among our earliest examples of Sumerian literature. So why do they sound like late-stage discourse? Why do they read like the middle of a conversation? The standard response, once again, is oral tradition. Perhaps centuries of verbal transmission preceded writing. That would explain repetition. That would explain rhythmic phrasing. That would explain why the text feels like inherited counsel. And yes, the instructions of Shuruppak use repetition, parallel structures, remembered phrasing. They carry the sound of spoken wisdom. But the technical vocabulary complicates the oral-only explanation. Legal terminology, administrative vocabulary, architectural concepts. These are the kinds of terms that often require written codification to remain stable and precise across generations. Oral cultures can preserve them certainly, but precision tends to drift without documentation. Terms shift, meanings blur. Specialized language becomes fluid. And yet in these early texts, the language feels stable. It behaves as if it belongs to an institution. Then there is another layer. The text shows awareness of mathematical concepts embedded inside practical advice. One passage advises about division of property using terminology that implies fractional arithmetic. Another reference to field measurement employs terms that suggest familiarity with area calculation. These mathematical concepts appear in administrative texts from the same period, yes, but their presence in wisdom literature implies something broader, that mathematical thinking had already permeated educated discourse, that it was not confined to ledger tablets but present enough to be referenced in moral counsel without explanation. And again, the text doesn't say, here is how fractions work. It assumes you already live in a world where such calculations exist, where such language is normal. So we ask again, because this is the kind of question that doesn't hold still, if writing is new, why does the text assume a world that feels already organized by writing? If literature is young, why does it speak with the confidence of established tradition? And then the Instructions of Shurupak invokes a concept we've already encountered in hymns and myths, the me, a word that resists clean translation. Scholars render it as divine decrees, cosmic laws, fundamental ordinances. The me represent organizing principles of civilization, kingship, priesthood, writing, music, legal practice, craftsmanship, social institutions, even intimate human behavior. Not mere ideas, but active forces, portable, transferable, guarded. In the myth of Inanna, civilization is not invented, it is acquired. Inanna travels to Eridu and obtains the me from Enki, loading them onto a boat and bringing them to Uruk. Culture arrives as cargo, and whether we take that literally or not, the conceptual posture is clear knowledge is something that exists prior to human invention, something to be received, something to be preserved. So when the Instructions of Shurupak references the me, it positions itself inside that worldview. It frames wisdom as inheritance, not innovation, as maintenance of order, not creation of novelty. And we circle back to our earlier theme because it belongs here too. If a civilization believes its knowledge exists from before, then writing becomes not a laboratory, but an archive. Not a place where ideas are born, but a place where ideas are protected. And the text also displays theological precision. References to cosmic order, divine justice, and the relationship between human and divine realms use philosophical terminology that presumes developed discourse. It uses terms for priesthood and divine service that appear across administrative rosters, ritual documents, and literary compositions. Again, no definitions, no introductions, only deployment. So, the modern reader can experience the text as simple moral advice, and in many ways it is. But for those who can see the technical understructure, the legal terminology, the administrative framework, the mathematical echoes, the text becomes something else as well. Evidence that a sophisticated institutional world already existed when our written record begins. And that pushes us back into the larger pattern we started with. The same pattern that Plimpton 322 embodies. The same pattern the flood narrative hints at. The same pattern early cuneiform suggests. Results appear without derivation. Frameworks appear without explanation. Systems appear already operational, and the question returns as it must. Did the Sumerians build this world rapidly in a compressed span, or did they step into a world already shaped by accumulated knowledge and use clay to hold it in place? In the next part, we move from wisdom literature into the sky itself, into the Venus tablet, and the institutional precision of long-term observation. And we ask again from another angle, what kind of civilization can sustain such records? And once more, we will return to the same thought, not because we lack other thoughts, but because the center holds. When knowledge appears already complete, what came before the tablet? The Venus tablet of Amisaduqa sits in the British Museum's collection, one copy among several that preserve the same kind of record, Venus moving in and out of visibility with quiet regularity as if the sky itself were keeping a schedule. The tablet catalogs what the planet does as seen from the Earth. When Venus first appears in the morning sky, how long it remains visible. When it disappears, the interval before it reappears in the evening sky, the duration of that evening visibility, then the disappearance again, over and over, not as a story, but as a sequence. And what makes it difficult to dismiss is not simply that it is detailed, but that it is detailed in a specific way, day-by-day precision, not just months, but exact days within months. Not just it rose, but when it rose, when it vanished, how long the interval lasted. It runs through a long stretch, 21 years, maintained with consistency that feels almost modern in its discipline. A record that requires patience. A record that requires routine. A record that requires someone to keep watching even when nothing dramatic happens. Modern astronomers have analyzed these records through computational reconstructions, and the observations match what Venus would have done close enough that discrepancies sit within what you'd expect from naked eye observation. The data is in that sense honest. The sky described on clay corresponds to the sky that would have been there. But the most difficult question is not whether the dates match. The deeper question is how such observation could be sustained. Because to track Venus's visibility is not a one-time achievement. It isn't a clever insight scribbled down in a moment of inspiration. It is an institutional practice. Someone has to watch the horizon at dawn and at dusk, daily, repeatedly marking appearances and disappearances that can be subtle, easily missed, easily confused with cloud or haze. Someone has to keep writing even during poor weather. Someone has to keep counting even when the work is tedious. Someone has to preserve the records so the next observer can continue where the last one left off. And that implies something we don't always name out loud. Observation on this scale is rarely the work of a lone person. Individuals do not carry 21-year programs reliably without structures around them. Institutions do. Temples, scribal schools, archives, offices, people trained not only to see but to record. People trained not only to record, but to record in the same format every time so that the data remains comparable across years, and that format matters. The Venus observations follow a rigid template date of first morning appearance, duration of visibility, date of disappearance, interval of invisibility, first evening appearance duration, disappearance. The structure repeats. It's not improvisation. It's protocol. And whenever you see protocol, you begin to sense tradition. Whenever you see tradition, you begin to sense time behind it. The Venus tablet is not alone. It belongs to a larger series, Enuma, Anu, Enlil, celestial omens, compiled over centuries, eventually spanning dozens of tablets, lunar phenomena, solar events, planetary movements, eclipses, unusual atmospheric signs. It is in its full form a vast archive of sky watching. And if even a portion of that archive reflects sustained observation rather than retrospective invention, then we are looking at something that had to run across generations. Some lunar records, for instance, depend on cycles long enough that one observer cannot simply figure it out by a season of staring upward. A 19-year recurrence of phases on the same calendar dates does not reveal itself quickly. It requires multi-year patience, and then patience again, because one cycle is not proof. The cycle must repeat and repeat, and be trusted enough that someone keeps watching long enough to confirm it. So we return to the same question because the Venus tablet does not let the question dissolve. How did they maintain this? How did they keep it going? Where did the institution come from? The records imply an infrastructure, observers trained to know what to look for, scribes trained to preserve the data, archives stable enough to hold it, traditions strong enough to survive regime changes and disruptions, all functioning smoothly enough that a 21-year program doesn't collapse into gaps and guesswork. And yet, when we look for the story of that institutional development, when we look for the early experimental phase, the "we're learning how to do this" stage, we find very little. The astronomical texts appear in our sources already mature. They do not read like first attempts. They read like practiced output. This is the same feeling we encountered with early writing itself and with early literature and with early mathematical tablets, the absence of a visible training phase. There are earlier astronomical texts, yes, reports, lists, procedure tablets, pedagogical material, but even these often assume a pre-existing framework. They are not stumbling around in darkness. They are working inside a method. And then later, another compendium appears, MUL.APIN, compiled around a later period, but clearly incorporating older material. It functions like an astronomical handbook. Star lists planetary periods methods for timekeeping through shadow lengths. A reference work, again a manual. The star lists identify constellations and their positions. The text organizes stars into three paths, Enlil, Anu, and Ea, corresponding to regions of the sky. It provides dates for heliacal risings for when stars first become visible before dawn. It ties the sky to calendrical reckoning. It is systematic, and the planetary periods recorded there, like Venus returning to the same position relative to fixed stars in an 8-year cycle, are impressively close to what modern astronomy confirms. But again, that kind of knowledge is not obvious from casual watching. It emerges through repeated tracking, through comparison, across years, through recognition that the wandering is not random, but periodic. So again, time behind it, generations behind it, a tradition behind it. And this is where the documentary feeling returns. These tablets do not only preserve beliefs about the sky, they preserve practices of watching. They preserve the output of disciplined attention. And then a quieter question rises, one that doesn't argue, but wonders. If the tradition is so disciplined, why is its beginning so difficult to see? If the archive is so extensive, why do we have so few traces of its early formation? It is always possible the evidence has not been found. Archaeology is incomplete and always will be. It is always possible early observational records existed in forms that did not survive or remain buried where we have not yet dug. But another possibility sits beside that one, and the Sumerians themselves gave it language, the idea that knowledge is inherited, received, passed down from before. Mesopotamian texts attribute astronomical knowledge to divine instruction. Enki grants understanding. The 7 sages, those figures placed in the world before the flood, bring wisdom, including knowledge of the stars and their patterns. Modern scholarship tends to treat that framing as legitimation, sacred pedigree for serious knowledge, and that is a sensible reading. But even as a rhetorical move, it points to a cultural posture. They did not describe knowledge as something newly invented in their own generation. They described it as something carried forward, which returns us once again to the same center, approached from another side. The Venus tablet does not explain itself. It does not tell us how the institution began. It simply presents the data, precise, consistent, almost indifferent to our need for origin stories. And when you stand before that indifference, the question becomes less like a puzzle and more like a mood. They watched long enough to know. But how did they decide it was worth watching in the first place? How did they hold the practice steady across decades? And what else did that same institutional patience produce? Because once a culture can sustain this level of observation, once it can record the sky with day-by-day discipline, it can also sustain mathematics measurement and calculation with a similar seriousness. And that is exactly where the next set of tablets brings us. Numbers pressed into clay with precision so high, it still unsettles modern mathematicians. Numbers that work. Numbers that arrive once again without explanation. In the Yale Babylonian collection, there is a small tablet cataloged as YBC 7289, a square of clay about 8 centimeters across. On its surface, a scribe drew a square and its diagonals. Along one side appears the number 30. Along the diagonal appear 2 numbers written in sexagesimal notation numbers that seem quiet until you translate them and realize what they are doing. They represent an approximation of the square root of 2, and not a rough approximation, not an "it's around here" estimate, a value accurate to 5 decimal places with an error so small it feels out of place in a world without calculators. The number on the tablet converts to something like 1.41421296. The modern square root of 2 is 1.41421356. The difference is tiny. The tablet is dated to around the Old Babylonian period, roughly the same broad era as Plimpton 322, the same environment of scribal practice, the same clay medium, the same quiet confidence. And again, notice the way the knowledge is presented. The tablet shows the result. It shows the diagram. It shows the numbers. It does not show the method. There is no working scratched out and corrected, no explanatory commentary, no derivation. The value is simply there, as if drawn from a known reference, as if the scribe expects the reader to recognize it, use it, trust it. And this is the point where the earlier question returns, and it returns in the same rhythm we've been following. How did they know? How did they calculate this? Where is the trail that leads to the answer? We can propose methods. We can reconstruct possible algorithms. We can imagine iterative procedures, reciprocal tables, approximation techniques. And scholars have done that work. But the tablet itself is silent about origins. It behaves like the output of a system, not the record of a discovery. Plimpton 322 deepens the feeling. 15 rows of Pythagorean triples arranged in columns, calculated correctly. Not the simple triples that beginners memorize, but complex sets with large numbers. Triples that require systematic generation methods and careful arithmetic to avoid errors. A single slip in calculation would break the relationship. And yet the table contains no errors. Again, the results are presented as finished, neat, procedural, like a tool. And we return to the same interpretive pressure we felt in literature and astronomy maturity without visible apprenticeship. Because the sexagesimal system itself is not trivial. Place value notation, where a digit's meaning depends on position, is a conceptual leap many cultures never made. Roman numerals did not. Egyptian numerals did not. Place value is not obvious. It requires abstraction, the idea that the same symbol can represent different magnitudes depending on where it sits. The Mesopotamian system does this. It scales upward units, 60s, 3600s higher, powers. It can represent very large numbers with consistent notation and very small values through fractional extensions. It allows arithmetic to be performed algorithmically. And what is striking again is that in our earliest mathematical and administrative tablets, this system is already deployed with fluent expertise. Even more striking scribes sometimes shift between sexagesimal and decimal notation within the same document, depending on context. Sexagesimal for certain measurements, decimal for counts of discrete objects maintaining consistency. That kind of numerical bilingualism implies a comfort with abstraction, the understanding that representation is a convention, and that conventions can switch without breaking meaning. And again, we do not see the early stage where the convention is invented, tested, revised, stabilized. We see the stage where it is already standard. The pattern continues in mathematical astronomy. In later periods, astronomers used step functions and zigzag functions, mathematical techniques that approximate periodic motion in ways that are not physically exact, but computationally powerful. These methods work because they prioritize predictability and tractability. They accept that exactness may be inaccessible, but useful regularity can be constructed. And the procedure text manuals for calculation often present algorithms without justification, methods without explanation, formulas without derivation, again, reference material. Now, you could argue this reflects a cultural documentary style. Perhaps Mesopotamian scribes were not interested in theoretical exposition the way Greek mathematicians later were. Perhaps they valued procedure, not proof. Perhaps the how was transmitted orally in scribal schools, while tablets preserve the what. That is plausible. It is responsible to keep that possibility present. And yet the feeling remains. Because when we look at Greek mathematical tradition, we can watch reasoning on the page Euclid's proofs, Archimedes' arguments, derivations that expose the mind at work. We can trace development in the writing itself. Mesopotamian mathematics often hides that developmental texture. It gives us results tools and procedures. It gives us competence, but not narrative. And once again, a quiet interpretive question rises. Is the absence of development merely a documentary convention? Or does it suggest that the development occurred elsewhere, earlier in sources that did not survive? Here too, the Sumerians offered their own framing mathematics as part of cosmic order. Enki, granting understanding. The Me, containing principles of number and measurement. Knowledge presented not as human invention, but as recognition of patterns inherent in reality. Whether we take that as literal belief or rhetorical posture, it aligns with what the tablets feel like. They do not behave as if they are inventing something new. They behave as if they are preserving something correct. And again, the mood returns numbers that are accurate across millennia. numbers that remain valid even when civilizations collapse, numbers that do not care who remembers them because their truth is structural. The tablets endure because clay endures. The numbers endure because the relationships they encode endure. And the method, whatever it was, has been pressed out of view, leaving behind the finished surface. So we circle back, not to force an answer, but to keep the question alive in the right register. If the mathematics is so refined, what training produced it? If the training existed, what institution sustained it? If the institutions were mature, where are their early footprints? Because the pattern is not confined to numbers or stars. It appears in law as well, perhaps most uncomfortably in law, where abstract reasoning about justice appears with mature clarity in humanity's oldest surviving code. And that is where the next tablets take us. Fragments housed in Istanbul, laws that distinguish intent from accident, compensation instead of retaliation, a legal philosophy that looks once again as if it arrives already shaped. And again, we will ask slowly, and more than once, not how could they possibly, but simply, what came before this? What did they inherit? And what in clay were they trying to make permanent? In the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, among thousands of cuneiform fragments recovered from southern Mesopotamia, there are pieces of a legal code, broken clay bearing the oldest surviving system of written law we can still read. Fragments of the Code of Ur-Nammu. Even the name carries a kind of weight. Ur-Nammu, founder of the third dynasty of Ur, ruling in the late 3rd millennium BCE. The surviving text is incomplete, a prologue, 32 laws and epilogue. Scholars estimate the original code likely contained far more, perhaps over 100 provisions, but what survives is enough to reveal a legal mind already working inside a structure. And once again, what strikes the reader is not simply that law exists. Of course law exists. Human beings have lived with rules, customs, punishments, and compensation for as long as we have lived together. The surprise isn't that people argued about justice. The surprise is the tone. The code does not feel like the beginning of legal thinking. It feels like the record of legal thinking that has already been practiced long enough to develop distinctions, categories, philosophy. The prologue establishes authority through divine mandate. The gods appoint Ur-Nammu to restore justice, eliminate oppression, and set equitable standards. Corrupt officials are removed. False measures corrected. Exploitation of widows and orphans prohibited. It presents reform, not invention. And that matters. Reform implies a pre-existing system, something old enough to go wrong, something entrenched enough to be corrupted, something institutional enough that officials can be removed and measures standardized. Then the laws begin. If a man commits murder, that man must be killed. If he commits robbery, he will be killed. If he commits kidnapping, he is to be imprisoned and pay silver. The code moves through offenses and penalties with procedural clarity. But what many readers notice almost immediately once they move beyond the obvious severity of certain punishments is the legal philosophy in other provisions. Unlike later Mesopotamian codes often associated with strict retaliatory symmetry, an eye for an eye or Ur-Nammu's code frequently uses monetary compensation. A man who severs another's foot pays silver. Breaking a bone requires payment. Serious bodily harm can be resolved through restitution rather than physical retaliation. And this is not trivial. It implies an understanding that justice can be served without reproducing violence, that social order can be maintained by compensation, that deterrence can be economic rather than bodily, that the productive capacity of the population matters, that society benefits when injuries are acknowledged and repaired through structured payment rather than escalating cycles of bodily revenge. This is not primitive law. It is law thinking about itself. The code also distinguishes between intentional and accidental harm. Different provisions apply depending on whether an injury was deliberate or unintentional. That requires something subtle, treating intent as a legal category. Recognizing that culpability is not only about outcome, but about mental state circumstance, premeditation, negligence. That is a philosophical move. It is also an institutional move. It implies courts and adjudicators capable of evaluating context, not simply counting wounds. And then the code ranges outward: property rights, marriage, and divorce, sexual conduct, agriculture, commerce. It regulates professional services, sets maximum fees for certain trades, standardizes weights and measures, protects vulnerable people from exploitation. Again, comprehensive coverage. A system, not a list. And once again, the same kind of question begins to gather slow, repetitive, persistent, not because we are trying to force the evidence into a dramatic conclusion, but because the pattern keeps asking for attention. Legal codes do not appear spontaneously. They emerge from practice. They codify customs already tested. They systematize case-by-case decisions. They stabilize what has been argued over and resolved again and again until a society decides this is worth fixing in writing. So when we encounter Ur-Nammu's code, we are not encountering law's birth. We are encountering law's crystallization. And that pulls us back again to origins. If Ur-Nammu was reforming, not inventing, then what was he reforming? If the code presumes courts, judges, enforcement mechanisms, administrative record keeping, then where are those mechanisms in the record before the code appears? We do have earlier legal documents, contracts, property transfers, court decisions, but nothing like comprehensive codification. Nothing that shows a slow, visible climb from informal custom to formal statute in the way we might expect if we were tracing an invention in real time. Instead, the code arrives and speaks in a mature voice. And the legal terminology, the technical vocabulary used to describe obligations, relationships, property categories, does not look freshly minted. It looks stable, standardized. It behaves like language that has been used long enough to settle into consistent meaning across contexts. Legal terminology doesn't stabilize quickly. Precision of language is earned through repeated use. Ambiguities are discovered the hard way through dispute. Vague terms cause confusion. Confusion causes injustice. Injustice forces revision. Over time, societies refine phrasing because phrasing determines judgment. That process takes time. It requires institutional memory. It requires a culture that records and remembers. And once again, we feel the same tension we felt with mathematics and astronomy. The end product is visible. The polished form is visible. The developmental scaffolding is not. Now, one explanation remains available, always available and often true. The missing stages may simply not have survived. We work with fragments. We work with what happened to endure. Maybe earlier legal codifications existed and were lost. Maybe earlier archives burned. Maybe the tablets lie undiscovered in the ground. Maybe the record is incomplete because history is incomplete. But then the mind returns again to the form of the surviving text itself. Not just what it says, but how it frames its own authority. The prologue and epilogue present law as divine justice made manifest. Ur-Nammu is appointed by gods to establish equity. The code is not portrayed as arbitrary human policy. It is portrayed as alignment with cosmic order. And that theological framing matters not because it proves supernatural origins, but because it reveals in epistemology justice is something to be recognized, not invented. Law is treated as a reflection of deeper reality. We have heard this posture before. In Sumerian cosmology, mathematics is cosmic structure. The me are not created, they exist. In the flood narrative, knowledge must be preserved because it maintains the world. In hymns, temples embody fundamental order. In King List's sovereignty descends from heaven. Again and again, knowledge is described as something older than the individual who records it. So, we return again to the central question, not to pin it down, but to approach it from one more angle. If Ur-Nammu's code is so mature, is that maturity the product of rapid innovation in a compressed period? Or is it the surface of a longer tradition, one the tablets only begin to show once it has already grown? And when we look forward from Ur-Nammu, we can see clear continuity. Later codes Lipit, Ishtar, Hammurabi echo, refine, and expand. The tradition evolves, the line moves forward, but the line moving backward is harder to see. And that backward invisibility is exactly the kind of gap that keeps producing the same quiet scholarly discomfort. Not a claim that something impossible happened, but the smaller, sharper sensation of missing steps. We have the code, we can read the laws, we can recognize the sophistication, but we do not have in the same clarity the story of how the system became capable of producing such a code. And this is where the question broadens again. Because law is not the only domain where Mesopotamian texts preserve mature results without preserving the visible experimental trail. We've seen it in mathematics, we've seen it in astronomy, we've felt it in literature. And now we turn to medicine, another field that should, in theory, leave behind a messy record of trial and error. Because healing is learned the hard way. Remedies are tested through bodies and time. Diagnoses are refined through observation and failure. Experiment leaves scars. And yet, when we open the medical tablets, we often find the same familiar posture, conclusions without recorded discovery, procedures without narrated experimentation, reference material, not research diary. And that's where we go next. Not to insist the answer must be extraordinary, but to keep listening slowly to what the clay keeps doing. It preserves what works, and it rarely tells us how it was learned. In the University of Pennsylvania Museum's Babylonian collection, there are medical tablets, many of them recovered from Nippur excavations. Clay again. Wedge marks again. The same medium that held astronomical observations and legal provisions also holds something more intimate, descriptions of illness, lists of symptoms, instructions for healing. And the first impression is not superstition, not immediately. The first impression is structure. These texts describe symptoms with a kind of clinical steadiness. Fever patterns are distinguished by timing and intensity. Skin conditions are differentiated by appearance, by location, by progression. Internal disorders are diagnosed through examination of urine stool and other observable signs. The descriptions are detailed enough that modern physicians sometimes not always can recognize what is being described. Certain entries align with jaundice. Others resemble fevers. Others suggest parasitic infections. That kind of differentiation does not come from guessing. It comes from seeing many bodies over time. It comes from watching conditions unfold. It comes from noticing how one pattern differs from another pattern even when both look similar at first. It comes from accumulated observation. And yet the tablets present that accumulation as if the accumulation is already complete. They do not read like a notebook of discovery. They read like a manual of practice. The texts say, in effect, this symptom indicates this condition. This condition requires this treatment. They move from sign to conclusion with a confidence that implies the conclusion is already settled. And so, again, we return to the same question, because it seems to be the question these tablets invite by their very tone. Where is the trail? Where is the record of how they learned to distinguish these conditions? Where are the cases, patient after patient, showing how categories were refined, how misdiagnoses were corrected, how outcomes shaped new understanding? The tablets mostly do not show that. They show conclusions. And then there is pharmacology. These medical tablets list hundreds of substances, botanical, mineral, animal, used in preparations. They specify ingredients, methods of preparation, dosages, administration procedures. Some prescriptions combine multiple ingredients in complex formulas, suggesting awareness that remedies can work together in ways a single ingredient cannot. Modern analysis has examined many of these remedies, and a remarkable percentage show genuine therapeutic value. Willow bark prescribed for fever and pain contains salicylic acid, the compound associated with aspirin. Various plant-based treatments contain substances with antimicrobial or anti-inflammatory effects. The ancient pharmacopoeia was not only symbolic, it was often effective. But effective pharmacology is learned the hard way. Natural sources are unreliable teachers. Many plants are toxic. Helpful compounds can be hidden inside harmful plants. Dosage matters. Preparation matters. How a substance is ground heated, mixed, diluted changes what it does. Learning which combinations heal and which combinations harm requires repeated testing, repeated adjustment, repeated memory. So we circle back again slower this time, because this is one of those points where pacing matters more than clean explanation. If many remedies work, then someone discovered that they work. If someone discovered that they work, then discovery happens somewhere over time, through trial, through observation, through risk. So where is that documented? Where is the experimentation? Where is the evidence of testing? Failure, refinement, the slow climb toward reliable treatment. We do have hints. Some texts include annotations. Scholars describe as tested remedies, marks indicating a treatment is proven effective. That suggests empirical evaluation. It suggests practitioners remembered what worked. It suggests they distinguish between what is merely tradition and what is confirmed. But we do not have, in most cases, the underlying records. We do not have the sequences of trials. We have the final stamp, this works, without the evidentiary trail. Again, conclusions without visible development. And the pattern continues into anatomy. The medical texts show awareness of internal organs, not always anatomically correct by modern standards, but aware, familiar with major structures. That knowledge would have been acquired by examining trauma victims, treating wounds, perhaps through animal dissection, perhaps through exposure to bodily interiors in contexts we can only infer. Yet again, we do not have detailed documentation of anatomical investigation. The texts present knowledge as established understanding rather than recent discovery. Mesopotamian medicine also distinguishes between types of practitioners. The ASU, a physician employing natural remedies and manual procedures, and the Asipu, a priest-physician addressing spiritual causes through ritual intervention. The texts associated with ASU practice are practical. They show natural treatment. They show procedural instruction. And even when the broader worldview includes supernatural causation, the texts often recognize natural categories. Some ailments are treated as transmissible between people, others as internal dysfunction, others as injury. This distinction between infectious and non-infectious conditions reflects a kind of conceptual sophistication, an attempt to see disease not as a single category of divine punishment, but as a landscape of different causes requiring different approaches. Then there are surgical texts. Instructions for treating wounds, removing foreign objects, addressing trauma. Some procedures are described in a tone that suggests they were done not merely imagined. One passage describes trepanation opening the skull. The script implies technique, expectation, procedure. And archaeology supports the possibility evidence of cranial surgery exists with healed bone around openings indicating some patients survived. But trepanation is not a casual practice. It is dangerous. Infection risk. Damage risk. Learning to do it requires skill. Skill requires training. Training requires a tradition. And we return again because the return is part of the atmosphere here. If the procedure is described confidently, then confidence was earned. If confidence was earned, then there were earlier attempts, earlier lessons, earlier techniques transmitted from teacher to student. So where are those early stages? Where are the training manuals? Where are the developmental traces? The tablets we have function as reference material for professionals, not as diaries of discovery. They tell you what to do, not how the practice was built. And there is another layer that ties medicine back to the broader pattern we've been tracing: mathematical precision. Dosages are specified by weight using standardized measures. The texts distinguish between units for different substances, implying awareness that potency varies. Proportion matters. This is the same quantitative mentality we saw in astronomical cycles and legal compensation and geometric computation. It is applied here to the body, to healing, to mixture and measure. And once again, the question widens, not because we're trying to force a dramatic answer, but because the evidence keeps drawing lines between domains. If medicine uses standardized dosing, then standardization exists. If standardization exists, then education exists. If education exists, then institutions exist. Scribal schools, training contexts, professional pathways. And by the time we can see these educational institutions clearly, the Aduba, the tablet house, they already function. They already have curricula. They already teach standardized material. They already produce graduates who can enter practice with competence. So, again, we feel that missing beginning. Again, we feel that quiet gap between the mature product and the invisible formation. And this doesn't prove anything beyond itself. It doesn't force the conclusion that knowledge was given. It doesn't demand a lost archive. It simply repeats the same structural pattern across domain after domain. The tablets preserve results. They rarely preserve the messy road that produced those results. And that is why when we step back, the problem becomes less about a single mystery and more about a collective shape, a simultaneity, a clustering of mature knowledge appearing early across fields at once. And that is where we go next, because when you place astronomy beside mathematics, law beside medicine, engineering beside literature, a troubling picture appears, not a sensational one, but a methodological one. Civilizations usually develop unevenly, but here, sophistication appears everywhere at once. And once again, the question returns quietly, patiently: is this rapid invention or careful preservation? When we step back from individual tablets, when we stop holding a single object in focus and instead let the larger archive come into view, a different kind of discomfort appears. It isn't the discomfort of one anomaly, it's the discomfort of a pattern. Because what we've been tracing, the precision, the maturity, the procedural confidence is not confined to one domain. It appears across multiple fields at once: astronomy, mathematics, law, medicine, engineering, literature. And it appears early, not in the late refined centuries after long documented development, but in the first substantial written records we can read. Already systematic, already standardized, already competent. And this is what creates what we might call the simultaneity problem. Civilizations typically advance unevenly. One domain matures while another remains simple. Priorities differ. Institutions support certain skills and neglect others. Even in cultures we admire for intellectual achievement, development is lopsided. Ancient Egypt achieved monumental architecture long before developing comparable mathematical astronomy. Classical Greece produced philosophy and literature that still shape us, while maintaining relatively limited observational astronomy for long periods. Medieval Europe developed sophisticated theology and political thought, while scientific practice lagged behind. Progress tends to be irregular, so when early Mesopotamian civilization shows sophisticated advancement across domains simultaneously, it pulls against our expectations. The mathematical precision in tablets appears alongside organized sky watching. Legal codes show philosophical distinctions, while medical texts show structured diagnosis. Engineering specifications appear embedded inside mythic narrative. Literature arrives with rhetorical control. It is not one peak, it is a landscape. So we return again to the same central fork because it keeps resurfacing no matter which path we take into the archive. Either we are seeing an unusually rapid intellectual expansion in 3rd millennium Mesopotamia, or we are seeing preservation of knowledge accumulated over longer spans, transcribed into clay when the medium became available. And both possibilities carry weight. The rapid development model says Mesopotamia's urbanization, irrigation demands administrative complexity and institutional concentration, created conditions where multiple knowledge domains advanced together. Social needs pushed mathematics, law, record-keeping, and engineering. Temple institutions supported specialists. Scribal schools transmitted techniques. Over a few intense centuries, sophistication rose quickly fast enough to appear sudden to us because our record begins late relative to the growth. This is plausible. Human societies can accelerate when conditions align. Progress can cluster. But the preservation model says something slightly different. Much of what appears early is not newly invented, but newly written. Knowledge may have existed in oral form in apprenticeship practice, in perishable media, in institutional memory, before clay archives became widespread. When writing stabilized scribes recorded what was already known. The sophistication appears sudden because we are watching documentation, not birth. This is also plausible. Writing often makes things look abrupt because it freezes an already living tradition into visible form. And the tension between these two readings becomes sharper when we consider how oral transmission typically behaves. Oral cultures can preserve complexity, yes. They can preserve long compositions, genealogies, ritual procedures. But precision tends to erode without reinforcement. Technical vocabularies drift. Exact values become approximate. Procedures simplify. The details that matter most to function are the details most at risk when memory alone carries them. And yet, in early Mesopotamian texts, we repeatedly encounter precision that seems unusually stable. Sexagesimal arithmetic executed consistently. Astronomical observations recorded with day-level discipline. Legal terminology deployed with clarity. Medical dosing standardized. Engineering specifications functional. So we circle back again, not to insist oral tradition is insufficient, but to note the strain placed on it by the evidence. How does a primarily oral environment maintain such mathematical accuracy? How does it maintain such terminological stability across cities? How does it sustain multi-decade observation programs without extensive record keeping? And if it did sustain these things, then what form did that record keeping take? Before the clay tablets we can read. Because the tablets themselves, when they first appear, already imply the institutions. They imply training. They imply archives. They imply professional roles. They imply that a person did not simply decide to record Venus for 21 years in isolation. They imply that scribes did not casually derive square roots to 5 decimal places as a hobby. They imply organized knowledge. So, again we return, and again we phrase it differently, because this question behaves differently depending on how we approach it. Are we watching invention happen fast, or are we watching documentation of a tradition that existed before writing made it visible? The Sumerians themselves often describe their knowledge as inherited. Their literature returns repeatedly to wisdom from before, to knowledge received from divine sources, to the me as fundamental principles that exist independent of human creation, to the 7 sages bringing comprehensive understanding from the world before the flood. Modern scholarship usually reads these themes as mythological legitimation, sacred origin stories that grant authority to institutions and texts. And that is a reasonable reading. Cultures routinely sanctify knowledge to protect it. But even if we treat it as legitimation, we should still notice the shape of the legitimation. They do not usually claim knowledge was invented yesterday. They locate wisdom in deep time, before catastrophe, before the present order, in an earlier age that required preservation. That choice is interesting. It suggests a cultural consciousness oriented toward transmission rather than novelty, toward safeguarding rather than innovation, toward maintaining correct knowledge across time. And when we set that cultural posture beside the documentary tone of many tablets, manuals, lists, tables, procedural instructions, the idea of preservation begins to feel less like an external theory and more like something the archive itself quietly implies. Still, we must move carefully here, because preservation can mean many things. It can mean copying older texts. It can mean stabilizing oral practice into written form. It can mean transmitting institutional routines across generations. It does not have to mean mysterious vanished civilizations. It does not have to mean supernatural delivery. It can simply mean knowledge existed before the tablet, and the tablet's purpose was to hold it, So we return again to the point we keep returning to because it anchors the whole rhythm. The tablets often give answers without showing their questions. They give results without showing derivation. They give mature frameworks without narrating their origins. And this is why the simultaneity matters. Because if it were only mathematics, we could say perhaps a localized burst of genius. If it were only astronomy, we could say perhaps a temple program that matured quickly. If it were only law, we could say perhaps a strong ruler codified existing practice. But when the same mature posture appears across domains, the explanations begin to require either a very rapid coordinated expansion of multiple fields or a deeper inherited base. And neither option can be proven cleanly from what survives. The evidence is partial. The clay preserves much, but not everything. It preserves results more than it preserves process. So we do not close the question here. We do not force an answer that the archive cannot support. Instead, we do what the archive itself seems to ask us to do. We keep returning. We keep asking. We keep turning the same core question slightly, letting it reveal different edges each time. What does early sophistication mean? What does it imply about time, continuity, and institution? What does it suggest about how humans hold knowledge through catastrophe, through flood, through political upheaval, through the simple erosion of centuries? And in the next part, we move toward what the texts say about themselves. How Sumerian compositions explicitly frame knowledge as pre-existing cosmic preserved. And we ask whether those claims should be dismissed as mere rhetoric, or read as revealing something about how these cultures understood their own inheritance. Because the tablets do not only preserve data, they preserve self-understanding. And if we listen slowly enough, that self-understanding may not answer our questions, but it may tell us why the questions keep returning. Up to this point, we've been looking outward at what modern analysis reveals: precision, sophistication, anomalous maturity. We've been asking what the tables imply, what the procedures suggest, what the institutional tone might mean. But the texts also look inward. They make claims about themselves. They do not always present their knowledge as newly produced. They often present it as received, preserved, passed down. And even if we treat those claims as mythological framing, rhetorical authority building, we still have to sit with the fact that the framing is remarkably consistent across genres. Hymns, flood narratives, king lists, wisdom literature. The language differs, but the posture remains. Knowledge comes from before. The Kesh Temple hymn that prays song to the goddess Ninhursag contains passages describing the temple not merely as a human construction, but as something established by cosmic decree. The temple possesses those fundamental principles we've encountered again and again. The hymn suggests the temple embodies order. It crystallizes cosmic structure into architecture and ritual practice. Now, it's easy to dismiss that as theology, and it is theology, but theology is also a way a civilization thinks about how knowledge lives in the world. In that framework, the temple is not only a building, it is an instrument tuned to the principles that make civilization possible. The design is not arbitrary. The design is alignment. And then the flood narratives make the preservation theme explicit. Before catastrophe, civilization exists in full. Before the flood, the mere present, laws, rituals, crafts, institutions, all the components of ordered life. Then catastrophe threatens to erase them. Enki intervenes not only to preserve biological survival, but to preserve knowledge. Even in fragmentary form, that is the logic that keeps surfacing. The survivor is not simply saved as an individual. The survivor becomes a carrier, a vessel for continuity. And notice how often Mesopotamian literature returns to that structure. Knowledge exists before disaster. Disaster breaks continuity. A small portion survives. The world is rebuilt using preserved wisdom. That is not one story. It is a cultural pattern. The Instructions of Shuruppak participates in this pattern by placing itself before the flood. It claims antiquity. It claims inheritance. It presents itself as wisdom that predates catastrophe. Whether that framing is literal history or literary technique, it functions to establish authority through deep time. This isn't advice invented. Now, this is counsel that endured. The Sumerian king list performs a similar move, locating kingship itself in deep antiquity. Kingship descended from heaven. Again, we can treat this as divine legitimation. But the phrase also implies something else. Governance is not invented as a human improvisation. Governance is the earthly expression of cosmic order. And then we come back to the me concept itself, because it is one of the clearest windows into Sumerian epistemology. The me are not created. They are not said to be designed by gods in a moment of invention. They exist as fundamental structures. Even deities operate within their parameters. In myth, they can be guarded, stolen, transferred, but they are not described as human creations. That is a particular way of thinking about knowledge. It frames knowledge as discovery rather than invention, as recognition rather than fabrication, as something that exists independent of the individual mind, waiting to be grasped and implemented. Mathematics in this framework is not arbitrary symbol play. It is the revelation of relationships inherent in reality. Law is not mere policy. It is the expression of justice embedded in cosmic structure. Astronomy is not a pastime. It is the recognition of heavenly order. So, again, we return because repetition here is not inefficiency. It's the only honest pacing for a question this large. If a culture thinks knowledge is discovered, then it will treat preservation differently than a culture that thinks knowledge is invented. If a culture thinks wisdom is older than the individual, then the act of writing becomes not only expression, but protection. The scribal impulse becomes archival, and that might help explain why so many tablets feel like reference material, why so many texts feel less like experiments and more like record keeping, why so many results appear without derivation, because the function is not to display how you arrived. The function is to preserve what is correct. Now, to be clear, this does not prove that knowledge came from a lost civilization, or that Sumerians possessed mystical access to the sky. It can be explained more conservatively. The culture developed over long pre-literate centuries, and when writing stabilized, it recorded what had already matured orally and institutionally. The mythic framing then expresses cultural value respect for inherited tradition. But even in that conservative reading, the posture matters, because it suggests a civilization intensely aware of fragility of continuity, fragility of memory, fragility of tradition under catastrophe. And perhaps that is why the flood motif is so central. Not because the flood was literally global, but because floods, real floods, were devastating enough to function as a symbol for rupture. They were the concrete experience of discontinuity, And when a culture has lived through rupture, through floods that bury cities, through warfare that destroys archives, through collapse that scatters institutions, the idea of preservation becomes existential. So, we return again to clay itself. Clay is the medium that resists catastrophe better than paper, better than wood, better than memory. Fired clay survives floods. It survives fire. It survives abandonment. It survives sometimes even deliberate destruction because broken shards remain legible. So perhaps the earliest cuneiform texts are not simply the first steps of writing. Perhaps they are in some sense emergency architecture, a response to an awareness that what humans know can vanish. But then another question surfaces, one that complicates even this interpretation. If the Sumerians were so committed to preservation, if they framed knowledge as inherited and older, why do we still see gaps? Why do we still see absence of developmental stages? Why do we still lack the early training traces? And here we touch again the limitation that never leaves. The archive is partial. We have thousands of tablets, but we do not have everything. We do not have most of what was ever written. We do not have the perishable media. We do not have the full libraries. We do not have the full curricula. We do not have the everyday teaching contexts where method was transmitted. So we have to be careful. The absence of method in tablets does not necessarily mean method did not exist. It may simply mean the tablets were not designed for that purpose. They were designed to preserve results for those already trained. But still, we cannot help returning to the tonal quality of the earliest texts. They do not feel like beginnings. They feel like continuations. And that brings us inevitably to modern scholarship, the academic response, and its attempt to explain this continuity without overstating the evidence. Because the academy has frameworks, it has models of gradual development, it has timelines anchored in excavated layers and carbon dates and material culture progression, and those models explain much. They deserve respect. But those same models also acknowledge difficulties quietly, cautiously when confronted with early sophistication that seems again and again to arrive already formed. In the next part, we examine that scholarly response, the gradualist model, the missing stage hypotheses, the role of oral tradition, the possibility of lost perishable writing, the idea of rapid innovation. And we do it slowly, not to reject scholarship, but to understand what it can and cannot settle. Because the question we've been circling is not a polemic, it's a tension. And tensions require patience. Modern archaeology and ancient history have developed sophisticated frameworks for interpreting early Mesopotamian civilization frameworks built on more than a century of excavation translation and comparative analysis. These frameworks are not careless. They are not naive. They are methods designed to keep interpretation tethered to evidence. And they explain a great deal. The standard model emphasizes long, gradual development during pre-literate periods, Ubaid and Uruk phases, millennia before extensive writing. Over those centuries, populations in southern Mesopotamia developed agriculture, irrigation, settlement, complexity, trade networks, administrative coordination, temple economies. By the time writing appears around 3200 BC, the culture is not starting from zero. It has already built the material and social scaffolding that can support scribes. In this model, early textual sophistication is not an anomaly. It is transcription. Writing is a new medium, but the knowledge written down is older. Administrative practices existed before tablets. Legal customs existed before codes. Mathematical techniques were refined in surveying and trade before reference tables. Wisdom literature existed orally before being impressed into clay. This is a coherent explanation. It honors the archaeological record of increasing complexity. It recognizes human capacity for sophisticated knowledge without writing. It avoids dramatic claims that depend on missing evidence. But even within this framework, especially when we examine the details, the same interpretive pressure returns. Because gradual development can explain sophistication, yes, but it struggles with certain kinds of precision. Mathematical knowledge degrades through oral transmission. Exact values blur. Algorithms simplify. Without written reinforcement, subtle numerical procedures tend to drift. Yet early mathematical tablets demonstrate accuracy that feels unusually stable. Square roots, approximated precisely, large Pythagorean triples computed without error, sexagesimal arithmetic deployed with consistent rigor. The scholarly model can still accommodate this by pointing to apprenticeship traditions and stable institutional memory. A craft can preserve precision if practitioners are trained carefully and practices are standardized through repetitive use. Surveyors, architects, accountants, people who must be correct to avoid material consequences can maintain numerical accuracy through lived discipline. But that explanation leads into another pressure point: institutional infrastructure. Maintaining astronomical observation programs requires organization. Sustaining standardized legal terminology requires courts, adjudicators, and record-keeping. Maintaining stable measurement systems requires administrative authority. Preserving medical dosing protocols requires professional training. So the model says temples and palaces created institutions. Scribal schools stabilized knowledge. Administrative bureaucracy supported standardization. And again, this explains much. Temple economies were powerful. Cities needed management. Social complexity produced specialists. Specialists needed training. Training produced schools. But the difficulty is that the earliest written texts already imply these institutions functioning at maturity. We have limited documentary trace of their formative stages. By the time we can clearly see scribal schooling curricula already exist, by the time astronomical protocols appear, templates already exist. By the time legal codes are written, legal terminology already feels settled. So, scholars propose a missing developmental phase, earlier examples not yet found or recorded in perishable media that didn't survive. That is plausible. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially in archaeology. We excavate only small fractions of ancient landscapes. Many sites remain buried or destroyed. Many archives were never preserved. And organic writing materials, wood, leather, reed, would decay. Still, there are complications. Mesopotamia's environment can preserve organic materials under certain conditions. Sealed containers, arid contexts, anaerobic deposits. If extensive pre-tablet writing on perishable media existed, we might expect at least some physical trace, or at minimum more frequent references to such media in later texts. Most Mesopotamian references to writing describe clay tablets. That does not eliminate the possibility of perishable writing, but it does leave it less securely anchored. Another scholarly approach emphasizes rapid innovation periods of acceleration driven by social and environmental demands. The argument is not that development is always slow. Sometimes it clusters. When conditions align, urbanization, trade networks, administrative pressure, concentrated institutions, multiple domains can advance rapidly. This is also plausible. History contains examples of intellectual bursts, scientific revolutions, periods where ideas crystallize faster than expected. Progress is not always evenly paced. But the Mesopotamian case has a particular challenge: the breadth. The sophistication appears across many domains at once. Explaining that through rapid innovation requires either a broad systemic acceleration affecting multiple fields simultaneously, which is possible, or extraordinary concentration of specialized genius across disciplines, which is less likely. Scholars also emphasize geographic and environmental factors. The Tigris and Euphrates created fertile potential, but only if managed through irrigation. Irrigation demands administration. Administration demands measurement. Measurement demands numbers. Numbers demand record-keeping. Trade networks spread ideas. City-state competition encourages innovation, all true and all relevant. But even these factors do not fully resolve why certain forms of sophistication, like precise sexagesimal place value notation or highly structured astronomical templates, appear so early without obvious transitional stages. So, mainstream scholarship often holds a balanced stance. Conventional models explain most of the evidence, but anomalies remain. The anomalies are treated as open problems for future research, not as reasons to abandon the broader framework. This methodological conservatism is responsible. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. To propose radically revised chronologies or large-scale knowledge inheritance from undocumented sources goes beyond what the evidence compels. And yet, after more than a century of intensive study, certain tensions persist. They do not disappear. They simply remain. And this is why the conversation keeps returning to the same core question. Not as an accusation against scholarship, but as an honest recognition that even the best frameworks have edges where evidence is thin. So we arrive again at the interpretive crossroads. Three broad ways of reading what we've seen. One, the symbolic mythology lens, treating technical precision as rhetorical, as cultural expression, rather than functional knowledge. This lens has strength and caution, but it struggles with the fact that much of the technical content works when tested. The mathematics is correct. The astronomical records match the sky. Many medical remedies are effective. The engineering designs are sound. Pure symbolism cannot easily account for that functional accuracy. 2. The encoded wisdom lens, seeing technical knowledge as real, but also philosophical, expressing cosmic order and metaphysical principles. This aligns with the me concept and with the theological framing of many texts. It honors the idea that knowledge is discovery of underlying structure, but it can relocate rather than resolve the question of development. How did such comprehensive integrated wisdom mature, and through what institutional pathways? 3. The historical documentation lens, treating the texts as attempts to preserve actual, technical, and institutional knowledge accumulated over longer time frames than our surviving record directly shows. This aligns with the flood motif of preservation, with the documentary tone, with the consistent framing of wisdom as inherited. But it depends on assumptions about missing evidence, lost archives, pre-literate accumulation, transmission mechanisms that are hard to prove directly. Each lens has strengths. Each has limitations. None can claim final certainty. So, what do we do with that? We do what careful scholarship does at its best. We acknowledge what is solid, and we keep the question open where the evidence is thin. What is solid is the sophistication itself. The tablets preserve it. It's verifiable. We can calculate the numbers and confirm they hold. We can model the sky and see that the observations align. We can analyze botanical compounds and find therapeutic value. We can read legal distinctions and recognize their conceptual maturity. The clay carries real achievement. What remains uncertain is the pathway by which that achievement formed and stabilized so early in the visible record. And this uncertainty is not a weakness. It is in a way an honest atmosphere. The ancient world does not give us complete stories. It gives us fragments, broken tablets, partial archives, scattered institutional traces. Reconstruction is possible, but it is always provisional, so the question remains not as a sensational mystery, but as a patient inquiry. How did they get there? And because we cannot close the question cleanly, the most honest ending is not a conclusion, but a return. A return to the silence across time. A return to the idea that for every tablet that survives, countless do not. For every archive preserved, many were erased. For every method documented, many were transmitted in ways that left no durable trace. Which means the gaps in our knowledge are not proof of impossibility. They are the ordinary condition of ancient history. In the final part, we move into that silence directly, the space between what survived and what vanished, and we let the question rest there, not solved, not dismissed, but held with the kind of patience these tablets themselves seem to demand. And after that, if you want, we can continue quietly into further revisions or into shaping the pacing and transitions for your full documentary arc. But for now, one more loop remains. One more return. One more slow look at the clay and the absences around it. 46 centuries separate us from the earliest Sumerian inscriptions we've been tracing. 46 centuries of wars, floods, fires, migrations, languages dying and being reborn under new names. Across that distance, the clay tablets endure not all of them, not even most of them, but enough to leave a footprint, strong enough that we can still feel its shape. And the first thing that shape does is remind us of scale. For every tablet we possess, how many were lost? For every archive preserved by accident, buried, sealed, forgotten, how many archives were burned, dissolved, scattered, ground into dust? For every line we can translate, how many lines once existed in libraries that vanished before anyone could even imagine a modern museum vault? These questions are not rhetorical ornaments. They are the condition of ancient history. The evidence we have is extraordinary, but it is also incomplete. And incompleteness is not a small detail. It changes the tone of every conclusion. It forces humility into interpretation, whether we like it or not. Because the tablets we've examined demonstrate a civilization that knew things, not in a vague sense, not in a mythic imagination sense alone, but in ways that can still be tested. Numbers on Plimpton 3:2:2 satisfy their relationships. The diagonal in YBC 7289 aligns closely with the square root of 2. Venus observations correspond to real celestial patterns. Legal codes distinguish intent from accident and build coherent systems. Medical tablets preserve recipes that can contain genuinely active compounds. Flood narratives embed engineering specifications that read as functional. This is not the language of pure fantasy. It is the language of people who cared about what works. And yet the archive is oddly reticent about origins. The tablets often preserve conclusions without narrating discovery. They preserve methods as instructions without explaining how those methods were developed. They preserve frameworks without offering their own developmental histories. They act like tools, not diaries, like manuals, not memoirs. And this is where the gap becomes something you can almost hear. We can read what they knew. We can confirm much of it, but we cannot always trace how they came to know it. We cannot always see the slow climb. We cannot always find the transitional scaffolding that modern developmental models would predict. That absence creates an interpretive tension, one we've circled many times because it doesn't resolve itself on first contact. Did knowledge develop rapidly under unusually favorable conditions, or did writing arrive as a preservation technology for knowledge that already existed in mature form? And once we say it, we realize we have to say it again, because the question shifts when we phrase it differently. Are these tablets the record of invention or the record of inheritance? And then again differently, are we seeing beginnings or are we seeing continuations made visible? This is where the flood motif becomes more than story. Mesopotamia is a landscape where floods happen, where cities can be buried in silt, where canals overflow, where disaster is not abstract. It is seasonal and sometimes catastrophic. When archaeologists find flood layers at ancient sites, they find physical traces of rupture. So, when Mesopotamian literature insists again and again on preservation through catastrophe, we can read it as myth, but we can also read it as cultural memory of discontinuity, a civilization aware that continuity is fragile, and fragility produces an obsession with preservation. Clay becomes a kind of answer to fragility. Fired clay can outlast institutions. It can outlast dynasties. It can outlast entire languages if someone later learns to read the script. The medium can carry knowledge across time, even when the world that produced it collapses. In that light, early writing looks different. Not just as a tool for administration, but as an attempt to outlast disaster. Not only a technology of communication, but a technology of survival. And this might explain why the earliest texts can feel so mature. Because if you are writing down what already works, what already matters, you don't begin with experiments. You begin with what must be preserved. This interpretation remains speculative, but it does not require supernatural explanations. It requires only a realistic sense of how cultures behave when they fear loss. Still, we cannot pretend the evidence forces one path. It doesn't. A rapid development model remains viable. Under concentrated urbanization, with temple economies supporting specialists with administrative pressure demanding standardization, multiple domains can advance quickly. Training institutions can stabilize knowledge. Protocols can crystallize. Practices can become standardized in surprisingly short periods when large systems require them. A longer accumulation model also remains viable. Knowledge can be refined over centuries before it is written. Apprenticeships can preserve techniques. Oral transmission can maintain complex structures. Perishable records can disappear. Then writing appears, and what we see looks sudden only because the earlier development was invisible to the material record we now possess. Both models can live beside each other. It may not be either /or. Different domains may have different histories. Some practices might be older, some might have accelerated, some knowledge might be inherited, some might be innovated. The archive may preserve a mix, and perhaps that is the most honest posture, not closure, but attention. Because there is a danger in studying early civilizations of forcing the past to behave like a story with a clean ending. We want origins. We want linear development. We want proof that our frameworks are correct. But ancient history often does not cooperate. The past is partial. The past is broken. The past speaks in fragments. So the question becomes not only what happened, but what kind of evidence survives and why clay survives. Perishable materials do not. Administrative archives survive in bulk because administration is repetitive. Philosophical treatises might not. Teaching oral methods might not. The record is shaped by the survival bias of media and circumstance, which means the absence of certain kinds of documents may reflect not the absence of those practices, but the absence of their preservation. And this brings us to the final quiet circle. The tablets endure, the knowledge persists, the questions remain open. And perhaps that openness is not failure. Perhaps it is in some sense the correct ending for an inquiry like this. Not a refusal to interpret, but a refusal to pretend interpretation can become certainty when evidence cannot support it. In the controlled environments of museums worldwide, Oxford, Philadelphia, Istanbul, London, these tablets sit under soft archival lighting, protected cases, catalog numbers. They are stable now. They are safe now. But their world was not safe. Their world was fragile. Their world collapsed and rebuilt and collapsed again. And yet the clay carries a thread of continuity, a thread of numerical accuracy, a thread of procedural practice, a thread of institutional memory, a thread of wisdom framed as inheritance. And the question that lingers again softly, again patiently, is not just how did they know, but how did they keep knowing? How did knowledge persist through disruption? How was it stabilized? How was it transmitted? And what does that say about us? Because when we look at the Sumerian archive, we are also looking at a mirror of our own vulnerability. Our own archives are not clay. Our knowledge is stored in forms less durable than pottery shards. Our civilization assumes continuity the way ancient civilizations assumed it until they couldn't. The Sumerians chose a medium that outlasted them. And if there is a lesson in this, not a moral lesson, but a contemplative one, it might be this. Human knowledge is powerful, but fragile. Civilization is capable of extraordinary sophistication, but it depends on preservation, and preservation is never guaranteed. So we end where we began, with the clay under soft light, with wedge marks pressed by hands that are now dust, with numbers and laws and observations that still hold true, and with an awareness that the archive is both astonishing and incomplete. The tablets do not give us final answers. They give us durable questions. They give us proof of human capacity, and they give us a silence, the silence of missing texts, missing stages, missing stories that forces us to be careful with certainty. The clay endures. The knowledge persists. The origins remain partly hidden. And perhaps the most honest response is to let that remain true, to acknowledge what we know, to recognize what we do not, and to keep returning slowly to the same core questions. Not because we are stuck, but because some questions are meant to be held, turned, and revisited across time. A final subtle note, only if you choose to, if you want more work like this quietly without breaking the atmosphere, you can subscribe or return for the next episode in this series. But for now, let the tablets rest where they are and let the questions stay open.